Septim's no Cyrodiil from what I've heard, though he rules their remnants and rebuilds their empire. He's something worse, or greater, depending on your disposition to the center, son. For the last 400 years, the petty kings of Cyrodiil have been squabbling over the title of Emperor, all claiming forbearance. Imperial throne's blood's thinner than a sea dream, and half as wet.
The entire history of Tamriel has seen the simultaneous birth and downfall of its numerous dynasties. These royal dynasties rose to power either through fame, force, or cunning, yet all of their empires are doomed to fall from grace eventually. The Third Empire of Cyrodiil suffered the same fate, but not before it left an everlasting imprint on the foundations of Nirn, bringing order to a continent of vast diversity. One of the most famous dynasties to have ever ruled on Tamriel was the Septim Dynasty, and that dynasty is the main topic of today's video. Hey there everyone, this is Xith, and today we'll be delving into the Septim Dynasty, which means that I'll be covering and elaborating upon each and every representative ruler of the Septim Dynasty and covering their individual time periods as rulers. This will be a two-part series mainly because there are a lot of rulers that this dynasty produced, and I've made it my goal to cover the reign of each and every ruler that assumed the Imperial throne. The second part will be released shortly after this is uploaded, and before we continue, I want to make it clear that I didn't cover every single detail of a ruler's life if the ruler was very famous or had plenty of information to them, and this is due to the fact that some of these people have enough information for a separate video. Now let's hop back into the topic at hand. Some were met with gruesome and unfair fates, and others managed to do right by their distant relative and founding father. What all rulers of this dynasty were fated with though was the burden of holding such a glorious position. In nearly all cases, succeeding rulers of this dynasty were expected to be better, if not equal to their predecessors. This bred a lot of pressure from the start, not to mention all the other societal aspects that plagued them daily. Some even felt the entire world was against them and succumbed to the pressure, leading to even more civil unrest and territorial disputes. This is why it's interesting to me to learn more about these rulers, because they are a prime example of the duality and complexity of mankind as a whole. Let's start with the ruler that started it all, the one that I could make a 20-minute video on, Tiber Septim. I won't delve too deep into the life of Talos Stormcrown, but I will offer you the basics of his time as an emperor so you can get a general idea of the founder of the Septim Dynasty and what he did for the people of Tamriel. The conquest that Tiber Septim waged during the Tiber Wars united all of Tamriel under one empire. Massive unification like this gave way for globalization and prosperity for citizens of the empire, but such vast territory will always be hard to fully control. Not only did he conquer all of Tamriel, but he made sure to improve the quality of life in his empire's homeland, Cyrodiil. During his reign, the region of Cyrodiil underwent geographical reconstruction, making it into a more hospitable environment. The Imperial city and other ruined cities were reconstructed as well, and new roads were even built to improve trade routes and accessibility to the region. He established a monarchy in Morrowind, which is a task worthy of praise considering how hostile the Dunmer and Tribunal were to foreigners. He's also credited for governmental reforms which garnered popularity amongst the citizens of the empire. In a bid to alleviate the potential conflict so much diversity in one empire could bring, Tiber Septim also published the Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition. This pocket guide served as an educational tool for anyone curious to learn more about the provinces and people of the empire. Tiber Septim also revived the cult of the One, and he personally worshipped the One, which served to bring reverence to the supreme spirit worshipped by the Alessian Order back in the First Era. He proceeded to build a temple dedicated to the One, but regardless of the temple and its revival, this monotheistic religion never really regained its former status within the empire. Although he had done some very good things for his citizens, there's also a lot of his shady business we aren't aware of, since nothing negative was ever allowed to be released to the public. Tiber Septim reportedly had an affair with the Dunmeri queen Baranzaya, and this affair resulted in a bastard child which Tiber Septim had aborted, forcing Baranzaya to also flee from the Imperial city. Hatred for orcs was also a big part of his public agenda because he saw them as puny and as lesser creatures. This hatred of his also denied orcs citizenship within the empire. Regardless, his public image as the hero god of mankind is what actually ascended to godhood, not his personal life. When he united the entirety of Tamriel, he proclaimed the end of the Second Era, commencing the Third Era with a united Tamriel. He would go on to rule until the year 38 of the Third Era for a total of 81 years. He's reported to have had one son whose name we do not know, and this unknown son of his went to birth another son who would become the succeeding emperor of Tamriel. The person that succeeded Tiber Septim was his grandson Pelagius Septim I. Now, since this is a video featuring a fellow YouTuber and friend of mine, I'll let him take it from here and cover a couple of rulers for you guys. Welcome Imperial knowledge.
Pelagius Septim I, the second ruler of the Septim Empire, went on to rule as his grandfather Tiber had done. Peace, stability and economic growth was prioritized and the people felt content with his rule. He unfortunately met an early end only 3 years into his reign while he was assassinated by the Dark Brotherhood whilst praying at the Temple of the One. Pelagius I was fond of Queen Berenzia in her youth when she was staying in the Imperial city with the Septim family. He reportedly loved her as a sister. One interesting thing to note is that the Arcturian heresy also claims that the Underking sought to become his advisor. His short reign was from the year 38 to the year 41 of the Third Era, and it was relatively peaceful, but it was definitely wasted potential. He was succeeded by his first cousin, Kintyra, because he hadn't managed to have a child of his own yet. Kintyra was the daughter of Tiber Septim's brother, Agnorith. Empress Kintyra, or the former Queen of Sylvanar, the city in Valenwood, succeeded her brother Pelagius I as the third ruler of the Septim Empire. She was blessed with a time of prosperity and good harvest, whilst also being an avid supporter of the arts, music and dance. Her reign, on the other hand, lasted just a tiny bit longer than Pelagius I's reign did. She ruled from the year 41 to the year 48 of the Third Era, and during that short time ensured peace and prosperity throughout the empire. After her death, she had a son who succeeded her immediately after her reign. His name was Uriel Septim I. He was the fourth emperor of the Septim Empire, and he succeeded his mother Kintyra after her death in the year 48. He was known as the Lawmaker by many. This title was earned because of the institutional reforms that he promoted in order to further establish independent organizations and guilds. These legal reforms gave way to guilds like the Fighters Guild and Mages Guild to rise to prominence again during his reign. His son, Uriel Septim II, succeeded him after his death in the year 64 of the Third Era. Uriel Septim II's reign as the fifth emperor was quite bad to say the least. His rule was unfortunately cursed with bad luck, plagues and insurrections of all kinds. His financial and judicial skills also didn't help this matter, for he inherited a very tender heart. This resulted in little justice done overall, which resulted in even more turmoil as the people saw him as unworthy of his title. He had two sons and a daughter. The sons were named Pelagius and Amiel, and the daughter was called Galana. Galana was supposed to be married off to King Antiochus of Solitude, but she secretly married someone else. Knowing that this would cause even more conflict, Uriel II offered up Galana's niece, Potema, who was only 14 years old at this point, as King Antiochus' replacement wife. This is where the story of the Wolf Queen of Solitude, Potema, begins, but we'll talk about her later. Uriel II's reign was relatively long, with 18 years, and he met his end in the year 82 of the Third Era, with his son, Pelagius Septim II, succeeding him. His son, Pelagius Septim II, did not only inherit the throne, but he also inherited all the bad decisions that his father Uriel II had made. This meant that all of the debt that his father had attained also passed on to him. This prompted the newly crowned emperor to invent drastic and unprecedented measures. He dismissed the entire Elder Council and only allowed those that could pay a great sum of money to return to the council. The same system was forced upon the various kings of Tamriel. This did in fact boost economic growth and eventually brought the empire back from financial ruin. And although the plan worked, the downside of this was the loss of wise advisors that were less financially fortunate because they couldn't pay to, retain their positions. He fathered 4 children, Antiochus, Cephorus, Magnus and Potema. These people would be the main faces of the War of the Red Diamond years later. And Pelagius II died in the year 99 of the Third Era after a 17-year reign, in which he had pulled the empire back from a colossal debt. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Antiochus. Antiochus Septim was the 7th ruler of the Septim Empire. He was viewed as a very flamboyant and careless figure, only focusing on his various wives and mistresses, which he also spent his wealth on. This allowed for civil strife to rise significantly, with people being generally unhappy with how he decided to rule over the empire. This high degree of carelessness almost led to the loss of the Somerset Isles to the Marmor, the Sea Elves of Pienene. This conflict was called the War of the Isles, and the Marmor forces were only barely defeated when a staunch alliance between Antiochus Septim and the Kings of the Isles was made, in the last moment. The only thing that managed to completely defeat the Marmor, however, was a freak storm, which legends claim was the invention of the Psijic Order. Although he was morally astray and a heavy drinker, some still considered him a good ruler. He died in the year 119, and his role was eventually succeeded by Kintyra II in the year 120 of the Third Era, who was his daughter.
Thank you. Now moving on to Empress Kintyra II. Empress Kintyra II's reign was a really unfortunate one, for she was bombarded with accusations of illegitimacy and then eventually a gruesome death. After her father's passing, the Elder Council suggested her as the next ruler in line to the Ruby Throne. This angered Queen Potema, as she wished for her son Uriel Septim III to become the next ruler in line. Queen Potema, knowing Antiochus preferred the company of many women, questioned Kintyra's legitimacy as a septim in order to convince the Elder Council to coronate her son instead. Potema gave a very convincing speech questioning her legitimacy and calling her a bastard child. But the Elder Council decided to honor their initial decision to crown Kintyra II anyways. Potema was then banished from the court indefinitely. Kintyra was then crowned in the same year that the War of the Red Diamond commenced. More information on the War of the Red Diamond and Potema can be found on a video I made on Potema herself, so check that out if you're interested. In conclusion, Kintyra II was just another casualty in Potema's path of war, and she met her end when the Duke of Glenpoint led her to his castle in Glenpoint, where Potema's forces waited for her. The Duke betrayed the Empress and fed her to Potema, leading to her imprisonment and eventual death. Whilst Kintyra II and her uncles Cephorus and Magnus waged war with Uriel III, Uriel III sent an army along the eastern islands of Morrowind. He then also mobilized more troops to instigate a coup and capture the Imperial city in order to claim the throne for himself. Despite Kintyra II's death, she was very young and had a lot to bring to the throne, such as being an accomplished mystic and even sorceress. As Uriel Septim III managed to capture the Imperial city, he was next in line as the Emperor. Uriel Septim III at a young age was conditioned to think he was the rightful heir to the Ruby Throne, and he held this belief until he died. He was married to Princess Rachma to earn the support of one of the kingdoms of High Rock. He eventually managed to capture the Imperial city and crown himself the 9th Emperor of the Septim Empire. His forceful coronation happened in the year 121 of the Third Era, and he only managed to last a couple years on the throne until the year 127, when he spearheaded an attack on Cephorus' forces in Hammerfell. He would then be captured in the Battle of Ichidag and sent back to the Imperial city for a proper trial. During his trip back to the Imperial city under guard of Cephorus I, a group of vigilantes attacked the carriage he was riding in and managed to burn him alive, marking the death of the Emperor Uriel Septim III. This was most likely a planned attack, as Cephorus most likely yearned to take over the throne as soon as possible and put that chapter to rest in order to focus on the fight that Potema was about to unleash. The 6 years he ruled for aren't recorded, but one can assume that not many were content with him, and that Cyrodiil in particular was filled with civil unrest. Not to mention how the attacks on High Rock, Morrowind and Hammerfell destabilized the entire empire and crippled the Imperial army. Later into the Third Era, however, a group called the Hormei formed, which believed that Uriel III and Potema were the last of Tiber Septim's direct bloodline, and with these ideals they acted against the interests of the later Septim emperors. Moving on, after Uriel III's death in the year 127, Cephorus Septim, brother to Potema, Magnus and Antiochus, assumed the throne as the 10th emperor. His time as an emperor was mostly spent worrying about the war with Potema. He was praised as being kind and intelligent, but also as a great warrior, which was probably why such a powerful enemy like Potema was even defeated in the first place. Still, it took him 10 years to defeat Potema, which left a hefty mental toll. This might also explain why he never fathered any children, or even why some sources like the Brief History of the Empire edition 2 states that he never married. The Wolf Queen book suggests that he did indeed marry a Redguard named Queen Bianchi, with whom he later ruled over Ghislaine Hammerfell, and that he had children but that they all perished during the War of the Red Diamond. So take it as you will. The book The Madness of Pelagius also states that he died childless and alone. His death then came in the form of a horse-related incident in the year 140 of the Third Era. Even though the children of former Emperor Pelagius Septim II were all quite old by now, Magnus Septim was still alive and in line to take the throne. He became the 11th emperor in the year 140 and left his position as the king of Wayrest to lead the empire. Wayrest in High Rock prospered before and after his time as an emperor, and it always received preferential treatment because of former Emperor Antiochus' special love for Magnus. Even though he was elderly by the time he came to the throne, his task was to punish all of the traitorous vassals and kings that supported Potema in her former rebellion. He had a son called Thoris Pelagius Septim or Pelagius Septim III. He married his son Pelagius off to one Katariah Ra'Athim, Duchess of Vardenfell. Katariah was most likely picked as she had close relations to Queen Berenziah. Now this decision was most likely influenced by the fact that the former Emperor Pelagius Septim I had a close bond with Berenziah and the clan Ra'Athim. Magnus married him off to Katariah because he noticed the gradual decline in sanity within his son, and he hoped that she could conceal those tendencies once he was in line for the throne. Magnus died soon after in the year 145, and his son assumed the Ruby Throne, commencing the rule of Pelagius the Mad. Thoris Pelagius Septim III, or Pelagius the Mad, assumed the throne in the year 145 and reigned more or less until his death in the year 153. He was a Breton born in Wayrest, serving as its prince. Later throughout his life in the year 137 until 145, he ruled as King of Solitude and High King of all Skyrim. His reign as both the High King of Skyrim and later Emperor was covered in notoriety, and all of that notoriety can be attributed to his insanity. Even when he was just the High King of Skyrim, he made sure to butcher relations with vassal states and kings, sending him down a path of widespread infamy. His state of mind deteriorated even further as he assumed the Imperial throne after his father's death in the year 145. His madness went to such an extent that he even tried to hang himself in front of noblemen at a great Imperial ball. The degree of insanity Pelagius displayed would surely lead to catastrophic consequences if he was left at such an important authoritative position. As mentioned beforehand, his father Magnus foresaw all of this and thus married him to Katariah to both improve relations with the Ra'Athim clan and keep Pelagius on a leash. This marriage allowed for Katariah to somewhat conceal his shenanigans due to her intelligent and diplomatic nature. Katariah would then also become Empress Regent 2 years into Pelagius' reign, when it became too apparent that he couldn't publicly rule anymore. When Pelagius' situation escalated into random defecation and biting, he was sent abroad to stay at various asylums in Valenwood, Blackmarsh and Torval. He eventually died from a fever in a temple of Kinnereth, but his torment didn't end there, and death for him was only a new form of torture. He ended up haunting the Shivering Isles and was never truly at peace. Upon his death, the throne was passed on to his wife Katariah. Katariah Ra'Athim became the 13th ruler of the Septim Empire in the year 153 and ruled until the year 200. She hails from a prominent family of Ebonheart in Morrowind. Before she was married to Pelagius the Mad, she was the Duchess of Vardenfell and a member of the Ra'Athim clan. Excluding her regency years, Katariah ruled for a full 46 years. Her reign was filled with conspiracies of all kinds, mostly about her legitimacy and bloodline. Her race was a question of debate because her reign is viewed as the time that the Septim bloodline stopped, as she didn't have any sort of relations to Tiber Septim himself. Others came to her defense though in claiming that she had at least birthed a son containing the blood of a Septim. Noblemen took to disliking Katariah, but the common folk absolutely adored her as she had their best interest at heart. She disliked staying in the Imperial city, and this habit to travel introduced her to many war-torn and ravaged states around the empire that needed help. This is why Katariah devoted her reign to repairing regions previously ravaged by the War of the Red Diamond, and much of the empire's resources were spent into improving relations with its population. The common people loved her far more than nobility ever did, which is why her time as an empress was considered one of the most glorious periods. She had two sons, one named Cassander, who was the son of Pelagius the Mad, and Uriel Lariat/Uriel Septim IV, who was the son of her second partner Galivier Lariat. Both Cassander and Uriel Septim IV would later inherit the Ruby Throne. The story of Kintyra Septim will continue in the next part. Thank you for watching, and be sure to stay tuned in order to get a glimpse into the lives and problems of the remaining Septim rulers.